Um, I read this here a while ago. It's called asali, which would, in the Swahili, be what you would call honey. Fikiri lay under the stifling night. Joseph was drunk on the cheap whiskey that had come to the town on the back of the truck that day, and she knew this was not the night to mention the opportunity. She listened to the creaking sounds of the shanty, the hoots of the jungle around her, the raspy breathing of her children, their murmuring dreams, and was eventually asleep herself. She was floating in the trees, smelling the golden honey, the buzz of the hive, and the unison of work. The next day, upon waking, she chopped wood, started the fire, and made chapatis for the children. They ate, and Joseph Jr., in his blue government school shirt, gulped his down, while her little daughter tore them into little pieces and nibbled. She was still often surprised they were so different. Joseph grabbed his bag, reached up to kiss her, and began the long walk to his school. Her head was still alive with the things the honey money could buy. An extra shirt and new shoes for Joseph. He would study like her brother would have had the war not taken him. She remembered him, mugging and remonstrating like his hero, Muhammad Ali, shouting, "Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee," and she took this as a sign. She swept the breakfast crumbs into her hand and gave them to her little daughter in order to feed the chickens, which had already made their way into the kitchen in anticipation. She chased them outside and started the long walk to the well with the water jug. She was relieved to see that there wasn't much of a queue. This meant that the water would be flowing freely, not choked to a trickle as it had been recently. There had been rain, and rain was good. As she approached the well, Melissa and Deborah's eyes found hers, and as she looked away, they knew she hadn't asked it. They lingered after they had filled their jugs and waited for her. They spoke under the burden balanced on their heads. He had the whiskey. He wouldn't have been sensible. He wouldn't have remembered. This hurt her, but Deborah was Joseph's sister, and she was probably within her rights to say this, and was probably correct in her estimation of him. Deborah knew, however, like Fikiri, that it was her family, the men of her family, who had tended the bees for as long as anyone could remember. She knew they used the old methods that the company men could approve upon. She knew more than that her brother and her few cousins who held the tribal right to keep the bees were lazy and were more interested in protecting their role, their identity, than maximizing the resource in order to feed their families. They were prideful. They joked at how the men were the drones and they were the queens and the workers. They joked here while they walked home, thinking it was dangerous, but they knew it really wasn't, because they also knew that if the men heard them, they would end up with sore eyes or backs or worse. When Fikiri arrived home, Joseph was up and gone. She went through her daily chores, eventually got word from her neighbor that Joseph and most of the men were at the club drinking whiskey again. They tissed inside, and she decided then that there was no choice. She had to speak with him. He arrived home with Joseph Jr. They walked in together. He was laughing with the boy, and she hated him the way he used his son to shield himself from her this way. Arm around him so that she couldn't accost him with his irresponsibility. He smiled at her in a knowing way, but she smiled right back, and he was startled. They sat down to their meal, chicken stew and more chapatis. The boys, both her husband and the son, ate vulgarly and hungrily. She wondered where the boy she had met had gone. She started the conversation the same way the man had. "Did you know that the price of honey in Nairobi is 40 shillings per liter?" Joseph was a honey hunter, like his father and father before him. This involved the climbing of trees and knowledge passed down about how the honey flow, when the bees would swarm, what forage was in bloom. But this has been for sustenance. The yield was small, eaten just in the village or compound, for celebrations and festivals. There have been rumors about the organization. Kenya was perfect for creating honey on a large scale, especially with the advent of all the flower cultivation. The erection of a few hives for a family on the Shamba would provide more money than they had ever had before. The stare was bloodshot and defeated. What other woman? He tried now to play with the daughter as a distraction. "You know they were here from the collective last week. We could place a few hives, Joseph." She knew the speech the other men gave. "The honey is wild. The secrets are mine. Would you take this from me? It is all I have, all my father gave me." She knew Joseph never made this claim, but he'd never had to. She remembered when she first met him. They were only 14 or 15 years old. She'd been sent out here from Nairobi to save her from the exploitation. The city was in disarray. Her brother was dead. She spotted Joseph within hours of arrival. He was lean and strong, and she would follow him around. She wouldn't know for years, until he whispered it to her in their marriage bed, how he longed for her when he saw her for the first time, the exoticism of her being from the city. He talked about her eyes always seemed to be looking beyond the present. He admitted that just before he asked her to marry him, that he worried she wouldn't be happy here, that she was still of the city, had been affected by it, and the village, the Shamba, would never be enough for her. She assured him that it wasn't true, that she couldn't see, didn't want to see anything beyond him. But as children came, as her aspirations for a better life grew and then withered, she worried now that she hadn't been completely honest with him, but there was nothing to do about that now. He kept moving his food around his plate. "I am not like them," waving his hand at his cousins. "But you don't see, the bees will know. They won't like it." She remembered him younger, the honey hunter, returning with his prize, eating the honey from the comb. She had seen him once mounting a tree, swinging from its branches, braving the bee stings, and then piercing the swollen hive with his knife, capturing the flow of honey in bags, and lowering them one by one to his little brother down below. Later that night, she found him near the edge of the compound. He had been celebrated that day as a young hero, returning with the honey. And as he turned to her, she let out a laugh. He had fashioned the wax into a set of enormous teeth, and he smiled at her. She had never laughed so hard, and she walked right up to him and kissed him on his horrible sticky mouth. The others present cheered, and they were married within weeks. Her look told him. He was holding back tears, some maudlin mood from the beer and whiskey and whatever else. His pride would be badly hurt, but he knew she would go forward with it. He wanted to forbid it. Her look demanded it, and the words were about to leave his lips when he halted, because if he didn't forbid her, then she wasn't defying him in some strange corner of his brain. He was there chuckling with the other men when the first rigs arrived. No man would help them. The women sweated in their bright sarongs. Michael, the man from the collective, would explain everything to them, help them stack the boxes with the frames. A few of the more curious men took a closer look, intrigued by the engineering puzzle that had been solved, but were chastened by a look from Joseph when they became complimentary of the workmanship. The women of the village began their apiary education in a little church hall. The men from the collective drove out of the villages each night. They had to. They could see the fierceness in the male villagers' eyes. They tried to speak with them, position the plan, asked the men if they had any questions, but the only thing that came out of their mouths when one of them spat at their feet. They began to erect the hives, 3 of them, in the Shamba allotments outside the village. This process was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, as the day's work would be discovered half undone the next morning. But in time, the hives were erected and the bees introduced. Fakira was fascinated and took to her work. She would don the gloves and muslin headdress, start a small fire in the converted teapot with dry banana leaves so she could check the combs for progress and interloping mealworms. The men laughed at her in her outfit. She dusted the morning with smoke, lulling bees into drowsy, sleeping flight. Some twisted and bent in fetal relaxation and fell from the sky onto the grass below. Her daughter, at her feet, chasing the drowsy bees, yet to be stung and learn her lesson, asked why they laughed. "They are scared." "Of the bees?" She looked full in her daughter's shiny face, and then at the chortling men. "No, my dear, of you." The colony was stabilizing. The 2 hives thrived, but Joseph would tell her this was because the acacia was in bloom, that the weather was dry, that they had only done the easy bit. The next stage was to establish the 3rd hive and attempt to lure a feral swarm into it. This would prove the plan, and they could grow from there. Joseph would return in the evening, sitting down at the table he had fashioned from orange crates, and ask about their day. Joseph Jr. would go first. He had tales of acute angles and symbolism and other words that were nonsense to him. And Fakiri knew, and Joseph knew, Fakiri knew, that this was just preliminary to what he really wanted to know, and that was whether or not the bees had come, which of course they hadn't. Even worse, she had to explain that 1 hive had become infected with mealworms, and that the swarm had absconded. Joseph nodded. He lit another bowl of sukuma wiki into his plate. "They will have gone to the cornflowers in bloom at the north end of the valley." He ate. Days went by. There were faltering attempts to lure a swarm, but they stayed well clear of the village. And then disaster struck when the final swarm abandoned the hives as well. The men from the collective would be returning, and they would have to start again. Fakiri's face failed. She helped Joseph Jr. with his homework before it got dark, readied Melody for bed, and retired herself. When Joseph joined a short time later, she turned from him and cried silently. Joseph rose again and went out towards the men's bar, where she could hear shouts and singing. The next morning, Fakiri tried to rouse Joseph, but he must have come in very late, and she could not. When she had fed the children and gotten the water, she visited the apiary and found that not one, not two, but all three were full of bees. She rushed around, and all the women came and celebrated. The men were quiet, most especially Joseph, and she didn't even know if she wanted to talk to him again, and she felt he had let him down terribly. The next week, when the men from the collective came, they began to inspect the frames to check the honeycomb. Michael let out a big sigh when he extracted the first one and saw the big collection of wax, like when the mealworms invaded. But then he chuckled. "What's this?" And he held up a grotesque pair of wax teeth.